So hi, I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and I am just incredibly excited. We have been planning this virtual tour of Kashmir in Krakow for many, many months. It was something that we started thinking about during the period of the pandemic when we were all largely isolating at home, with the strongest desire to connect with the world and missing the experiences of travel. And we connected with Tomasz, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, who is the scholar in residence of the Workers' Circle Jewish Journeys to Eastern Europe, and will be joining us again in May of 2022 when we return to Lithuania and Poland. And I'm just putting in a plug at the start to say we now have 3 spaces left. We limit our incredible journey to 30 participants, and we have 27 signed up. So if anyone listening to this says, as I think everyone should take, says I really need, it's time to take a journey back to Jewish roots in Lithuania and Poland, you can go to circle.org and sign up while there's still seats left in our journey. Otherwise, we will open up a waiting list. So without further ado, I want to give you some background on our incredible scholar in residence tonight and in the coming journey, Dr. Tomasz Cebulski. Tomasz was born in Krakow, and he grew up in Auschwitz, which is also known as Auschwitz in Poland. He has 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from, and Tomasz, correct me if my pronunciation is bad, Jagiellonian University.
Jagiellonian University, perfect.
Jagiellonian University, which is in Krakow. His master's degrees are in international relations and European studies and Middle and Far East studies, and his doctorate dissertation in political studies is titled Political and International Aspects of the Functioning of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in the years 1980 through 2010.
Now you can breathe.
In what?
Now you can inhale after reading this entire long title.
I'm breathing. So in 2016, Tomasz published a book, Auschwitz After Auschwitz, History, Memory, and Politics, 1980 through 2010. And his book debates the dynamic of construction of Holocaust memory and provides insight into the Auschwitz Museum through analyzing the politics of memory and conflict resolution. In some sense, as you're hearing what I'm describing, you can imagine all the many conversations we have along our journey. Shortly after 2020, he established a new visual project, Sky Heritage Pictures, which presents historical sites from a new drone vantage point, and we're going to experience some of that tonight. In addition to Sky Heritage Pictures, Tomasz are you the founder or you're involved with Teen Flying University?
I founded it.
You founded it. So I'm just learning about this now. It promotes history education among Polish youth, and the project develops history awareness among students by connecting them to the narratives of local sites of memory and involving the youth in these sites' maintenance. I also want to mention that Tomasz is an incredible genealogist and has a practice of helping people connect with their genealogical history. And we'll be sharing with all of you a link to Tomasz's website, and you can be in touch with him after the program. And as I said, he's going to serve yet again as our scholar in residence in 2022. So now I turn over the camera to you, Tomasz, to take us on our virtual tour of Kashmir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anne, for this incredible introduction. So I think you are speaking about somebody else, not me. So And I'm blushing here. Thank you very much for inviting me one more time and for entrusting me with this new project that we are actually right now about to premiere in a few minutes. We produced a film which has about half an hour altogether, which is showing the highlights of Kazimierz Jewish district in Krakow. This is a district which, for all kinds of reasons, is important and unique. I'll try to answer the question why it's unique along us watching the film. As you've heard from this introduction, I'm mostly growing from being a political scientist and to a certain degree a person dealing with Holocaust memory and with trauma memory. That's my major scientific objective, also recently entering more into genocide studies, but this is not the topic for today. Why is it not the topic for today? I strongly believe that in order to build any kind of proper narrative of what happens in this geography in between 1939 and 45, we need to start with stressing very strongly of who were the people and where they've lived and what kind of civilization they've built. Civilization which to a large degree is no longer. Without having understanding of that, without understanding what was here before 1939, I'm always persuading my students that they will never understand what actually happened in the places like Auschwitz or in the places like Treblinka. So this is what we are going to do today. We are going to have a glimpse into the civilization of Krakow Jewry, specifically Kazimierz Jewry. The film we've produced with the Walker Circle is a certain combo of contemporary imaginary, which I've recorded over summer this year, but I've also decided to support myself with historic films. Most of you must be aware that there were a lot of documentary movies recorded, mostly commissioned by the American Jewish charities in the 30s. Joint was spending quite a lot of money in the later 30s, particularly between 35 and 39, into sending filming crews and recording Jewish life in Poland as it was looking like just before the war. There's actually a series of 5 films like this recorded in the large Polish Jewish cities before the war, and then 5 cities showing Jewish life in shtetls. So I'm using some excerpts from the film recorded in 1939 in Kazimierz, showing Jewish life in there. So that's a certain added value into this project of ours. The beauty and miracle of Kazimierz, about which we'll talk a little bit later, is the fact that this is, I'm adamant in repeating that, almost, if not the one and only, medieval Jewish district in Europe, which means medieval Jewish district in the world, which is coherently preserved from the 1300s all the way up until now. And a certain bonuses, it still has a Jewish community. It still has a Jewish community which is developing and growing. So that's a certain miracle in a situation worth stressing. We are going to enjoy this district from different perspectives. We are going to fly over this district a little bit to show you a slightly different vantage point of places you might have already experienced or you will experience in the next years. But also a little bit of takes from the ground with a little bit of my commentary and also commentaries of my friends. So without further ado, I would like to invite you. We decided to play certain sections, to put on the screen certain sections of this movie. The first section is about 7 minutes, and then we are going to open the floor. After the 7 minutes of content in the film, we are going to open the floor. I would absolutely love to hear your impressions. If you have any questions that are coming to your head while you watch, please put the questions in the chat. In those breaks in between the next parts of the film, I will try to answer those questions and address those questions that you will be asking. So, this being said, I invite you for premiere of the Kazimierz virtual tour.
Welcome to Kazimierz. We are standing in a very symbolic place, a place which is marking the very beginnings of Jewish settlement here. In the heart of the Jewish district of Kazimierz, in Wolnica Square, which used to be the main market square of this district. It used to be as large as the market square of Krakow itself. Later on it was built over because such a large space was not needed. In the base of the building, which was built as the city hall for the separate city of Kazimierz in the medieval time period, there is a plaque, and the plaque is marking the legendary or true reception of the Polish Jews into the Kingdom of Poland sometime in the 1300s. Of course, the legend has it that the king for the reception of Jews on those areas was King Kazimierz the Great, so that would take us into 1300s. But obviously we know that the Jewish residents in Krakow were already having their institutions as early as 1200s. That first Jewish community was in the very city center, in the district which is right now the University district. Only in 1400s they had to move into Kazimierz.
Krakow, a city 1,000 years old in the south of Poland. In Jewish tradition, it is called Kruke. From 1138, Krakow was the capital of the kings of Poland. They established their residence in the glorious Wawel Palace, which dominates the entire city. The famous Cathedral of Wawel. Here are interred Poland's kings, her national heroes, and poets. These is the Church of St. Mary, built in the Gothic style. Its towers all of different heights. Every hour, a trumpet blast is sounded from the top tower. This trumpet blast is also broadcast daily at noon throughout Poland. In 1495, the Jews were expelled from their homes and went to live in the village of Kazimierz, not far from Krakow. Until the middle of the 19th century, the Jews of Krakow continued to live in cramped quarters in Kazimierz, which became the Jewish ghetto of Krakow. In the 19th century, the village became a part of Krakow, and from 1867, Jews were again permitted to live in any part of Greater Krakow. Nevertheless, a considerable portion of the Jewish population, which numbers 60,000 souls, lives to this day in Kazimierz, which the Jews call Kuzmir.
Behind me is the magnificent building of a 1400s Old Synagogue, which was stylized a little bit like Germanic synagogues built in Erfurt or Worms in the mostly Rhine River. Those communities have to flee because of growing anti-Semitism and also crusaders invading more and more often minority communities in Europe. In early 1400s, there is a large influx of Jews from Prague coming to Kazimierz, coming to Krakow. Crusades very often were limiting themselves into plunder, attack, and destruction of the minority communities in Europe more than reaching the target of Jerusalem ever. Behind me is the already legendary Szeroka Street, the Broadway. When we talk about the beginnings of the city, and every city starts with the decision about the size and shape of a market square. Yes, the cities were nothing more in medieval times as large merchandising centers on the convenient crossroads. So every city starts with shaping of a market square. In case of Kazimierz, there are a couple of those squares. There's definitely Wolnica Square, which is taking more of a rectangular form. But Szeroka Street, the Broadway, from pretty much 1300s up until World War II, remained a major Jewish market square in the district of Kazimierz.
Of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. But returning to my statements about Kazimierz being the one and only coherently surviving Jewish district in Europe, yes, some people compare it, for example, with Józefów in Prague. Rightly so, because the districts started more or less on the same early medieval time period. The problem with Józefów is, as much as the synagogues are there, but as much as the synagogues in Józefów are there, unfortunately, the entire district of Józefów in Prague was completely erased to the ground in the late 1800s under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, leaving only the synagogues and completely redeveloped. So it lost its coherent medieval character. Kazimierz never did. I'm comparing here, looking for a coherently preserved Jewish district. I'm comparing Kazimierz with Ghetto Nuovo in Venice, which is more or less dated the same and growing in importance also mostly in 1500s. Which, by the way, was an incredible time of rich contacts in between Venice and Krakow. Let alone we mention something which is called printing press, which was an internet kind of a discovery of 1500s or late 1400s and early 1500s. And yes, it came to Krakow from Venice. And yes, those were, for example, the Hellich brothers, three Jewish brothers in Krakow, which established one of the first printing houses in the Polish kingdom. Not the first, but one of the first. But why am I stressing Kazimierz being so unique? Well, it's unique from the perspective of the fact that it was Krakow under the German Nazi occupation that became the capital of the German Nazi occupation of Poland. Poland ceased to exist. It was replaced largely by a German-invented area called the General Government District. And yes, it was Krakow that was the capital of it. In spite of the fact that it was governed by Hans Frank, who was hoping and acting to have the city of Krakow proclaimed Judenrein as the first in this part of Europe, in spite of the level of destruction that was brought to all of the communities around, in my opinion, it's an absolute miracle that the entire Jewish district of Kazimierz survived, with all 7 synagogues, with almost all buildings. It is still there. Just to remind you, the German Nazis entering to Poland in September 39, this is just 1 year after the Kristallnacht. So the concept of synagogues burning is something that was very deeply engraved in their imaginary and sense of aesthetics, I would say. And there were thousands of synagogues that were torched immediately, not the ones in Kashmir. How many Jews, I'm just trying to read some of your questions. What year was the film made? It looks nicer than what we say 20 years ago and even 4 years ago. You know, the film that you, I mean, the core film that you are seeing was produced literally over the last few months. And historic excerpts are from 1939. Why did the synagogue survive? I could see this question repeated. Ellie, do you have any photos? Okay. What is totally interesting refers to Poland? How many Jews are living? How many Jews are living there? And the synagogues active? Okay, so two major questions. Why the synagogue survived? I would say a certain miracle / coincidence. The German Nazis did not establish their ghetto in Kazimierz. The ghetto was moved to another district on the other side of the Vistula River. In March 41, the district of Podgórze, a certain part of it, is changed into the ghetto. The Jewish district of Kazimierz is becoming kind of an emptied buffer zone in between the Germanized city center and the castle, which is taken over by the German governor Hans Frank, and the ghetto on the other side of the river. In the meantime, after 1941, when the Jews are expelled from this part of the city and pushed into the ghetto, there's a whole system of German trust agencies which are starting to go building by building in Kazimierz, and they are plundering property that is inside those buildings. And interestingly enough, most of the synagogues are being used at first as storages. They are being used as storages for plundered property, later on used as storages of something else. So very often the interiors were very badly damaged. All of the interior arrangement of it was usually destroyed and removed, but the exterior of the building was not touched because it was used as a warehouse. In case of a temple synagogue, it was used for a certain time period, also a stable for horses and garages for cars. So the German Nazis found them useful, and up until the end of, up until the liberation of Krakow in January 45, there never came a time, an idea, and maybe even resources after 43 to have the synagogues exploded. Also, you need to remember that this city did not have an uprising, as was the case in other cities. Very often, the destruction of synagogues, as was the case of the great Tomasz synagogue in Warsaw, it was destroyed just after the Warsaw uprising. It was exploded in mid-May of 1943. Nothing of this scale happening in Krakow. So that's the answer why the synagogue survives. It's a mixture of a certain miracle and coincidence, I would say. The most important, they are there. The other question is whether there are any Jews in Krakow. Yes, there are Jews in Krakow, and interestingly enough, most of them are still focusing their life, particularly institutional life, in Kazimierz. Out of those 7 synagogues that survived, we have the temple, the Rima, the Kupa, and Isaac, which are being used for regularly, were used for religious practices. Isaac, up until recently, was used. Right now it's under renovation and its status is kind of suspended. So 4 synagogues were used for religious practices. And you have a whole variety of community. Altogether, of course, we are talking about a couple of hundreds of Jews in the city, comparing with the number of 64,000 before the war, making 25% of the city population. Right now we have a couple of hundreds, but you get all possible shades and colors and concepts of Judaism present. So from JCC, which is very liberal and very culturally, but also religiously in a reformed way connected, through Hasidim that were running up until recently the Isaac Synagogue, also through a regular Orthodox community that is mostly focusing around the Rima or Kupa synagogue. So you got everybody there. Under the Nazis, were the Jews expelled from Kazimierz or sent over to a ghetto? Yes, under the Nazis, Kazimierz was not converted into the ghetto, which was usually the case in cases of all the other 800 ghettos that the Nazis established. But they were always picking the former Jewish district to have it converted into the ghetto, not in Kazimierz. The major reason why Kazimierz was not converted into the ghetto and the ghetto was pushed on the other side of the river, it was just too close to the supposedly to be idyllically Germanized city center, definitely too close to the royal castle, which was occupied by Hans Frank, the governor of the occupation of Poland. We can actually read that he has a problem with how close the Jewish district is in his diaries and other documents, in which, quoting him, he cannot imagine the smells of Jewish kitchens reaching into the windows of his palace. No, Kazimierz was not converted into the Nazi ghetto. The Nazi ghetto was pushed on the other side of the river. Okay, I think we'll stop it for now. And if I may ask for another section of the film.
Yes. It's actually the European reality. Wherever you look into whichever former Jewish district in any European country, the reality is that all of those which are still having any remnants were going through a massive gentrification over the last 20, 30 years in particular, becoming chic, residential, and sometimes extremely expensive. At the same time, became, particularly in summer, very crowded with tourists and visitors. But somewhere within this modern glam surface over those districts, you can still find the relicts, you can still find somewhere on the outskirts the survivors in form of surviving architecture. You can still find a little bit more genuine and original structures which are proudly resisting this new trend and this new idea of changing it into something in between being fashionable and being actually commercialized, because this is what those districts are sometimes reduced at the end of the day. Talking about those remnants and those things which are still remaining in Kazimierz, if you look carefully enough, you can come across still hundreds of the traces after mezuzot. Kazimierz is known for a lot of non-obvious places, and we are standing at a very non-obvious and a complicated intersection of streets. So this is an intersection of Bożego Ciała, which goes as Corpus Christi Street, with an outstanding Rabbi Street, because the intersecting street is Rabbi Meisel's, a very famous religious but also political leader of Polish Jewry in 1800s. One of the buildings that is standing here before the war was called Hevratilim, so the Psalmist Society, a society which was religious because the building had a synagogue in the ground floor, but it also had a cultural association which was taking the upper part of the building, and that's right now the building behind me. Well, after the war, obviously it was abandoned and nationalized. All of the painted walls with synagogal paintings and polychromes were covered with wooden shingles. The building was claimed back by the Jewish community based on the Jewish communal property restitution law from late 90s. Then it was very poorly rented into the private hands of a man who was running a heavy metal disco club in it. Whether anything like a heavy metal disco club exists? Well, yes, it existed in Kazimierz for a short time. The owner of this establishment removed the wooden shingles, and to everybody's surprise, underneath the shingles, there were polychromes of Western Wall, of Rachel's grave, and also Hebrew paintings and prayers. Over the last few years, the building is rented again into private hands. It's right now having a cafeteria and a cultural center called Hevra, which is obviously a slightly better usage of a historical space. This takes us into a fascinating and a very important question which needs to be debated about what shall we do with heritage sites, about what is the level of preservation and for what reasons do we preserve, and what is the level of commercial usage and how do we commercially use the sites which are still marking and are the traces of the civilization of Polish Jewry and Krakow Jewry. Just to remind you, 64,000 of Jews before the war in Krakow, servicing about 7 established synagogues and a couple of hundreds of shtibels, smaller prayer houses all around the city.
The Altashul, a synagogue built in the 14th century in the shape of a fortress, the oldest synagogue in Poland. A synagogue built in the 16th century bears the name of the Rima, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, one of the great codifiers in the history of Judaism. Here he composed the Mappa, or the tablecloth, to complement the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo from Safed, and to adapt it to the customs of Ashkenazi Jewry.
Welcome to the Rima Jewish Cemetery in Krakow, one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in this part of the world, among the oldest in Europe, that's for sure. It dates back to the first half of 1500s and is named after an outstanding Talmudic scholar, Moshe Isserles, better known by the first letters taken from his writings, creating an acronym of Rima. Such is the name of the cemetery itself. and such is the name of the adjacent synagogue. The synagogue, interestingly enough, was built based on the private property belonging to the father of Moshe Isserles. In the excavations of the last 5 years, we've actually unearthed a warehouse, because the father of Moshe Isserles was a pretty outstanding and successful merchant in his times. But returning to Moshe Isserles himself, he studied in Lublin, in the famous Lublin Yeshiva under Shalom Shachna. He returned to Krakow somewhere around mid-1500s and became the renowned, one of the best known European legal authorities on interpretation of Talmud and Torah. The Treaty of Moshe Isserles is a folio of Ashkenazi interpretations on top of Yosef Skaro Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch translates as the set table, so the set table of Jewish halachic laws that every Sephardi, because Yosef Karo was a Sephardi Jewish family, would use on the daily basis. There was a problem of using this Yosef Karo Shulchan Aruch, also 1500s interpretation, by the Ashkenazi Jews up north. And here comes Moshe Isserles. Here comes the Rima rabbi. He have created an Ashkenazi interpretation and an Ashkenazi folio of legal interpretation on top of Shulchan Aruch. Moshe Isserles is obviously also buried here. So right behind me there is a grave of Moshe Isserles which survived, and he is buried along his closest family members. When you look around this very cemetery, you can see that quite a lot of stones are having a characteristic Renaissance Italian ornamentation. Well, quite a lot of the stones were unearthed in the after World War II excavations and brought back to the surface in order to be shown as a cemetery. The cemetery itself during World War II was very badly destroyed by the Nazis. It was actually changed into a rubbish dump, and most of the stones were missing after the war finished. So in the 50s, the cemetery was re-restored in the course of excavation, which in itself was highly controversial. But because of those excavations, we can see the stones from 1500s.
The old cemetery next to the synagogue named after the Rima. Here are buried great rabbis of the period. Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the great Talmudist Rabbi Yaakov Polak, the Kabbalist Rabbi Natan Neta Shapira, and many others. On Lag BaOmer, the anniversary of the Rima's death, thousands of Jews come from all over Poland to prostrate themselves upon his grave.
Yes, this was a section mostly about rabbis and the Rima Synagogue, which is important not only as a historical monument, but also extremely important religiously, especially that on the yard sites in April, around April every year, you can see the thousands, actually dozens of thousands of Orthodox Jews coming to visit the grave of Moshe Isserles. So it's a very important pilgrimage site, a part of being a historical site of importance. I see a question, very interesting question about Plaszow. So the territories of the former German Nazi concentration camp Plaszow, which was built in late of 1942 on the outskirts of Krakow, built partly on the territories of two Jewish cemeteries. In order to have this camp established, the German Nazis pretty much destroyed the cemeteries completely, exploded one of the largest Jewish buildings ever built in Krakow, the humongous Tahara building, so the Jewish pre-burial house. And on top of this place, partly they've established a growing concentration camp, reaching the capacity of over 20,000 of prisoners at the time. Pretty much beyond 1943, Plaszow was the only place in which Jews could be alive in the larger Krakow district. This is the camp you know from Schindler's List, because it's featured But right now we have, for many years already, we undertaking all kinds of works in order to make this site a little bit more readable historically. The first important thing happened in the 50s. The site itself was proclaimed a historical monument and was preserved as a site without the buildings. There was no museum created, as was the case of Auschwitz and Majdanek in 1947, in which museums were created, which means an institution was called to protect not only the site, but also the buildings. In case of Plaszow, the site was protected from, for example, being constructed over, and the site is there, but the site is empty. And I personally find something very important about the fact that the site is empty, and very telling, particularly if you can show the site to people before coming to Auschwitz, in which everything is up there and standing. So this contrast of a former German Nazi concentration camp, which was razed to the ground, and which is looking more like a park, and Auschwitz is telling, in my opinion. But in the last 20 years, there are concepts of redeveloping the site into a museum for many reasons. One of the major reasons, maybe I'll mention here, is the fact that it's a site of burial. It's a site of burial of a couple of thousands of Plaszow victims. And we do have those graves very well geo-radared right now and described. And when it was more taken apart, a role of a city green, it was more and more loosely used as a park, with all kinds of strange human behaviors on Sunday afternoons, including walking dogs for an area which is a cemetery. So there were a lot of attempts. The most recent is the most advanced. There's a partnership between the university, the Jewish community, and the city of Krakow, actually the historical museum, the Museum of Krakow, in redeveloping the site into a new memorial, new museum. One of the historical buildings that survive will be an exhibit. There will be, the project is to be organized in a least aggressive way towards the territory, and is to make this site a little bit more readable. So right now we are in, we've actually just called the museum council last week, and the works are underway in order to have the museum built also on the side of this territory. So that's to answer the question about Plaszow and the undertakings there. Some press, museum, section, have compliments of Sephardic Jews. And asking, yes, there were some Sephardic Jewish communities, particularly in Zamość. If you ever visit Eastern Poland, some of the Polish nobility were actually deliberately settling Sephardic Jewish communities from Turkey in order to develop trading routes with the Ottoman Empire. In late 1500s. So yes, there were very few, but there were some Sephardic communities. All right, I think the time is flying very fast. So let's see the last section of the film.
So in the 50s, the cemetery was re-restored in the course of excavation, which in itself was highly controversial. But because of those excavations, we can see the stones from 1500s.
The old cemetery next to the synagogue named after the Rima. Here are buried great rabbis of the period. Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Heller, the great Talmudist Rabbi Yaakov Polak, the Kabbalist Rabbi Natan Neta Shapira, and many others. On Lag BaOmer, the anniversary of the Rima's death, thousands of Jews come from all over Poland to prostrate themselves upon his grave.
Welcome to Plac Nowy. Before the war, it was named a Jewish square for a reason. This was one of the few places in which the fate of Christian inhabitants of Krakow and the fate of Jewish inhabitants of Krakow would intersect. Yes, for centuries it was trading. It was trading where the lives of Christians, Jews, and also all kinds of other minorities inhabiting Poland and inhabiting Krakow would intersect. This was the place of gossip, this was the place of small talk, this was the place of getting to know each other, This was a place of building a very important social cohesion, or I would say a very important social security fuse in you can get exposed to the other, in which you can actually have a conversation, you can see a human being in this other who otherwise might be pictured within the framework of your religion as the different, as the dangerous, as the one that you shall stay away from, as the one you shall not interact, God forbid intermarry. So economy historically had a very important function in getting people exposed to each other and in this way intersecting and intertwining people's faiths.
There are many synagogues in Krakow, and they recall days of glory as well as days of massacre and heroism. The Kupashul, the Popper, and the Tall Synagogue, where the prayer hall has been built on the top floor for security reasons.
So within the 700 years of Jewish presence in Kazimierz, a lot of things have changed. And the Krakow Jews, but also Judaism as such, is absolutely following those changes. Particularly 17th, 18th, 1900s were speeding up social, religious, but also architectonical changes, political changes within the Krakow Jewish community. Here we are in front of one of the last established large grand synagogues of Kazimierz. This is the great temple synagogue which was built in 1860s, and this was built for the community which from early 1800s, taking the example from the Jewish communities in Germany and Vienna. Just to remind you, Krakow at that time is the part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and one of the cities of Galicia. So those Krakow Jews are believing that the future is in Neology Judaism, as they were calling it. The future is in trying to adapt into the life as it changes outside the Jewish community, to adapt a little bit to modernity, to accept the fact that we can abandon certain part of orthodoxy for the sake of being admitted into the Christian world. This is also a part of a decision and a mode of how to evade anti-Semitism, which was recurrently coming into the surface. So philosophically, it is a belief that when we adapt, when we abandon certain parts of orthodoxy, we will be accepted. Yeah? We will live and will contribute to the city itself, to the academia, to the medical system, legal system, and so on. So as much as the history of Krakow Jewry is hidden and confined within all of those traces that we are following, the traces of architecture, the traces of mezuzot, the traces of buildings which are still there and used to be Jewish or Jewish institutions, the future of Jewish community in Krakow is confined within one building, which is standing in Kazimierz for over 10 years. Interestingly enough, it's one of the very few modern architectonical additions into the Kazimierz district. And this is the 10 years in existence building of JCC. But the building is not enough. A JCC is much more than just a building. The JCC is about an institution that fills this building and people that are making JCC. And over 10 years, there's a tremendous growth of Jewish life, Jewish presence, looking for Jewish families and Jewish heritage, establishing the elderly club and the club for the survivors, which is offering all kinds of assistance, from kosher food through rehabilitation into trips into Israel. But also, for the last couple of years, something gearing more towards the future within this building is a kindergarten.
Educational institutions maintained by the Jews of Krakow. The Hebrew language is also taught in other schools. The Mizrahi, the Tachkimoni, the Beit Yaakov, in the Ort and the Ognisko trade schools, in the commercial high schools, and of course in the cheters and yeshivas of Kazimierz.
There are a few reasons why Kazimierz is so unique and brings so many people from all over the world. First of all, it has not been destroyed. So what we have here is the original fabric of the town that was created throughout the centuries. So that's one unique feature, that whatever you see here, this is pretty much unique and original. Second of all, Kazimierz history is unique. It was created, a part of it was created as a Jewish town. So we know that in the history, usually the story is that there are towns and cities where the Jews are not allowed to settle. In Kazimierz, the story was very different. It was the part of the city that where Christians were not allowed to settle by the orders of the king. So the space that was uniquely created for the Jews was created here when the Jews were expelled from, especially in the end of 15th century, expelled from the city of Krakow.
So certainly this uniqueness of Kazimierz is on various layers and various levels, and whether you look at the history or contemporary situation, you see the diversity, and I think this is one of the elements that survive from the ancient or medieval times, the coexistence of various groups in Kazimierz, the coexistence of various cultures, but primarily Jews and Christians living together in this district. And I think this coexistence, historical one, has some continuity today. We see a lot of diversity and much more, I would say, tolerance and openness to other groups than just the majority living here. So this is one thing. When you look at the Jewish heritage here, certainly Kazimierz was unique because of being Ashkenazi Jewish life center, and this is something that made it unique in the so-called Golden Age in the 16th and 17th century. But today we see both intellectual and material heritage of this golden period, which is to some extent carried on by the community in the later period, but to some extent it's also forgotten or maybe not appreciated enough.
So after the war, the district was derelict, pretty much deprived of its pre-war population, and it started to be deliberately settled by all kinds of people who are, let's call it, social outcasts. So all kinds of people who are problematic for the new communist authority were being settled in Kazimierz. This Kazimierz is becoming one of the most neglected and at the same time dangerous districts of Krakow through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. It was only in the 90s when a certain revival comes in, when the eyes of the world, the eyes of Poland itself are turning back to Kazimierz again, and it comes at the day and time of a certain return of memory of a Jewish community that once lived here, but also return of memory about the Holocaust. Kazimierz is a topic again, largely thanks to the film industry. Yes, it was in the early 90s, exactly 1992, when the large filming crew appears in Krakow and starts to shoot the scenes for the Schindler's List. We are standing in one of the places that was used as a scenery a couple of times in the movie, and in such way became immortalized and iconic by being shown on the Schindler's List. In such way also became the tourist attraction. Yes, very often people visiting Kazimierz those days are more interested in the sites and places which are secondarily created to be famous by the film industry, rather than exploring the original prime history that happened here. Or maybe those places that are secondarily reproduced on the films are helping the visitors and helping the tourists to return mentally and memory-wise to the people that lived in Kazimierz pretty much from medieval time period all the way into 1942 and 3.